Ko Sarah Tallboys Toka Ingoa. I'm a member of ANZEA's board, and yes, really want to extend a very warm welcome to you to ANZEA's Kai and Korero session for August. And just to get us started, I'll begin with a karakia, and this is whakataka taho. Whakataka taho ki te uru, whakataka taho ki te tonga. Kia mā kena kena ki uta, kia mā taratara ki tai. Ehi ake ana te atakura. He tio, he huka, he hohu, ti hei mauri ora. And as you will see by the slide on the screen, today's presentation is about equity in action, and it's monitoring access to the Accident Compensation Scheme for Māori, Pacific, Asian and disabled communities. And we have our presenters, Dr. Mairead Shanahan and Dr. Andrea Knox, with us, ready to go. And I know that they're going to introduce themselves, so shortly I will pass on to them to do that. But just to let you know that they would like questions to be posted into the chat, and they'll be addressed at the end of the presentation. And my colleague Ruth Pritchard, who is also on the ANZEA board, has very kindly offered to monitor the chat for us. So if you could do that, that would be great. So very much looking forward to an interactive session. And Mairead and Andrea, I'll hand over to you.
Kia ora, Sarah. Thank you. So welcome everybody to our session today. I'll introduce myself first and then I'll hand to Andrea. So tēnā koutou katoa. Ko eirana, ko kōtirana, ko inarangi te whakapaparangi mai, inari ko ahitereria te whenua tupu. Kai wararapa o e noho ana, he kai rangahau o ACC, ko Mairead Shanahan. Tēnā tātou katoa. So my name is Mairead Shanahan. I have English, Irish and Scottish ancestry. I hail from Australia. I was raised on the Sunshine Coast, which is Gubbi Gubbi people's land, and I pay my respect to elders past, present and emerging. Always was, always will be Aboriginal land. And I am a senior research advisor at ACC, and I'm here to talk to you about this access reporting work that I've been leading for the last couple of years, as we just figured out. I'll hand to you, Andrea, to introduce yourself now.
Tēnā koutou katoa, ko tararua te maunga, ko ohau te awa, ko tainui te waka, ko Ngāti Te Kōrahi te iwi, ko Andrea Knox toku ingoa. He kaitātari rāranga mātua ahau ki te herenga mahara. I'm Andrea Knox. I'm currently a principal analyst at Te Herenga Mahara, the Mental Health and Wellbeing Commission. But at the time of the work that we're talking about today, I was an independent consultant contracted by ACC. And yeah, so this was a really kind of big piece of work. And I'm really excited to be here today to talk to you about it with Mairead. I'll pass back to Mairead.
Yeah, really couldn't agree more, Andrea. This was a big piece of work and we're really quite proud of it at ACC. So we're very happy to be here today to take you through it. So as advertised, this is the foundational research that enabled ACC to develop methods for measuring and monitoring access to the Accident Compensation Scheme. We call it the scheme, focusing on equity for Māori, Pacific, Asian, and disabled populations.
I'll just jump in here. Sorry.
Yes.
Would people please ensure that their mics are on mute? Just thank you very much. There's just a little bit of background noise at the moment. Thank you.
Thanks, Sarah. I didn't quite hear that through my nerves, so I appreciate that. Okay, so the research problem that we were looking to address was in 2023, there was an amendment made to the Accident Compensation Act, which now requires ACC in each financial year to prepare a report concerning access to the scheme by Māori and identified populations and provide the report to the Minister as soon as practicable at the end of each financial year. So the legislation specifically asks us at ACC to identify an appropriate method for measuring access to the scheme, identify populations, so along with Māori, other populations of interest, and then consult on the method and identified populations with relevant people, and then report on levels and disparities on access to the scheme for the first, second and third access reports. For the second and third access reports, we're also focused on understanding the barriers to the scheme and what can be done to address those barriers. So we needed to be confident that we had identified populations who face challenges in accessing the health system, because people access ACC by lodging claims for injury through the health system, for example, through their GP, hospital or physiotherapist. We also needed to be confident that the proposed method for measuring access to the scheme would be methodologically robust and give us the ability to monitor trends in levels and disparities in access for the identified populations over time. So we contracted Andrea to help us do this. And spoiler alert, we published the access report in March this year. So that was yay worthy stuff. I've included a link to all the published reports and relevant materials on this slide. So to identify the populations, myself and my colleague Harshali Kumar undertook a literature scan basically to understand what we know about access to the system at ACC. And what we found was that at least 20 years of research shows that Māori, Pacific people, Asian people, and disabled people experience disparities in accessing the health system. For these folks, for Māori, Pacific people, and Asian people, systemic factors such as structural discrimination and bias, and systemic factors such as socioeconomic status, locality, language and health education, language and education limitations inhibit access to health and social services. We also found that there's limited partnerships with and a lack of collaborative systems and service design approaches with Māori, Pacific people, and Asian people, and this also drives inequitable access. We found that for disabled people, systemic ableism and a lack of accessibility in service design and delivery can result in poorer access to health and social services, and that research shows that needs-based interventions are required to address these access inequities. In relation to the ACC scheme specifically, we found that cost, travel, and language barriers to accessing health providers impacts entry to the scheme. We found that Māori are more likely to have their claim declined and experience slower cover decisions. And we also found that we need more culturally responsive and appropriate approaches to service design and delivery to ensure access needs are being met. So that's how we arrived at, along with Māori, our identified populations for measuring access to the scheme. But we still didn't know how we were going to actually measure the disparities in access and levels of disparity for these populations. So I'll hand to Andrea now to explain how she did this.
Yeah, it wasn't just me, but just thanks, Mairead. Yeah, so as Mairead's talked about, the key issue driving this work is a need to monitor whether people equitably access the ACC scheme when they're injured, or whether some groups struggle more to access ACC when they have an injury. And so when Mairead and Sarah approached me about this project, my first question was, where do we find data on whether someone has been injured and not made an ACC claim? And they said, yeah. So that's really been the key challenge with this work, is finding data that is on injuries, but is independent of whether an ACC claim was made. And so for that reason, we didn't just jump straight into analysing data, and instead started with a massive metadata trawl to try to find some data on injuries that was independent of ACC claims. And so the data we wanted to find needed to identify if someone had been injured within a specified time frame and regardless of their ACC claim status. It needed to be able to be linked to data on whether an ACC claim was made. It also needed to be able to be linked to data on ethnicity and disability status so that we could disaggregate it by ACC's identified populations. And ideally, it would also have data on other key things that influence injury prevalence and healthcare access. It needed to be nationally representative, and it needed to be current and ongoing collection of data into the future. So we looked at all of the data sets on the right of this slide, plus a few more that aren't there. And unfortunately, we found no data that met those criteria. We did find that the general social survey used to ask people about whether they had been injured, but unfortunately those questions were discontinued in a big revamp of the survey after 2012. What was really cool though, and we had this kind of absolute hallelujah moment, was when we found a PhD thesis by Michelle Poland, who she's still in the field. Some of you may know her or work with her. Massive shout out for the work that she did, which was very influential in this project. So what Michelle did was she used data from the SOFI longitudinal survey, which included a question about whether people had been injured in the last 12 months. And she linked it to ACC claims data in the IDI and used that to estimate claim rates among injured people and to assess the associations between claim rates and factors associated with the likelihood of making a claim. So basically, she did exactly what we want to do. Unfortunately, the SOFI survey was discontinued after 2009, so we can't just copy what she did. But Michelle's work was proof of concept that using survey data linked to ACC claims data can be used to estimate how likely different groups are to make a claim when injured and then be starting to get at the equity of access questions. So we decided to focus our further work on using a survey-based method. And if we go to the next slide. Okay, so we supplemented what we'd learned from Michelle Poland's work with an analysis of claim rates among injured people using data from the 2008 to 2012 general social surveys linked to ACC claims data in the IDI. And we did that because we wanted to get some slightly more recent data than Michelle's data from 2009. We wanted to find out how consistent the results were across surveys. We wanted to analyze results specifically for the ACC identified population groups, which were a little bit different to the groups that Michelle used. And we wanted to get an understanding of how different types of injury questions affect the results. And a thing to note there is that the GSS injury questions were actually framed quite differently to the injury question in the SOFI. So how this worked is described in the left panel of this slide. What we did is we used the GSS survey data to flag whether someone had been injured in the 12 months prior to their GSS interview. And then we used ACC data in the IDI to compute the proportion of those injured people who had also had an ACC claim in that same 12-month period. And overall, we found that 56% of people who reported an injury in the GSS had also had an ACC claim. So then what we did to look at equity of access is we compared those claim rates across the ACC identified population ethnicities. And we also looked at age group and a few things that we won't show. And you can see the ethnicity results on the right here. So what we found is that there are lower claim rates among injured Māori, Pacific and Asian people compared to people not of those ethnicities. But you do see some pretty large error bars on the chart. And so there are some limits on statistical significance of those differences due to survey sample sizes. And particularly that's the case for Pacific and Asian ethnicities because the GSS didn't use booster samples for those groups. But one thing that is really good is that these findings are actually really consistent with Michelle Poland's findings from the SOFI survey, and that gave us some reassurance about the reliability of the approach. And in a more detailed investigation that's not shown here, we did find that injury rates are sensitive to question design, and also that the SOFI did a better job than the GSS of identifying people with injuries of a similar profile to the types of injuries that are covered by ACC. And I will pass back to Mairead.
Thank you, Andrea. So, as a result of this work, we, ACC, were able to work with StatsNZ and Health to design and implement an injury question for the New Zealand Health Survey. This will enable us to monitor the relationship between injury prevalence and ACC claim rates ongoing, which was a key thing that the legislation asked us to do. So the New Zealand Health Survey is nationally represented with a large sample size, and the data is placed in the IDI, and that means it meets the requirements that Andrea was discussing in a couple of slides previously. It also means we can link survey respondents to ACC claim data. And this helps us to identify if people are saying that they got a relatively severe injury and don't have an ACC claim, because this constitutes an inequitable gap in people's access to the scheme. So when I say relatively severe, the threshold that we went with in our conversations with StatsNZ and Health was an injury that stopped you from doing your usual activities for more than a week. So the data is currently being collected during the 2025-2026 period, July to July, and we're expecting to have updated injury prevalence data available in the IDI for analysis in early 2027. So like I just said, the question is, in the past 12 months, have you had an injury that stopped you from doing your usual activities for more than a week? Taking into account what Andrea said about sensitivity to question design, we've got slightly different versions of the question for caregivers of children aged 1 to 14 and caregivers of infants less than 1 year old. And the question is based on the SOFI question, because this question did a slightly better job of identifying injuries than the GSS data points. And I'd just like to shout out our amazing colleagues at StatsNZ and Ministry of Health for helping us to help senior leaders see the importance of collecting this data, and for their very conscientious and robust analysis of the question. So when we got to this point where we realized, okay, we don't have current injury prevalence data, we decided to get Andrea and Dr. Michelle Morris to do an analysis of ACC claim rates in the IDI. And I'd just like to acknowledge Dr. Michelle Morris for her contribution to this work. It was definitely a team effort, wasn't it, Andrea?
Absolutely.
Yeah. And so the survey data will be useful for ACC in 2027, but in the meantime, we were obligated to report on access as best we could. And also, as Andrea has pointed out, there will be limitations on the usefulness of survey data, especially in that you struggle to do much in the way of intersectional analysis using it. And intersectional analysis was a foundational concept that we had built into this access reporting work. But it's a struggle because of the sample size constraints. And the new survey question will also not allow any time series analysis going back before 2026. And I'll hand to Andrea now to continue discussing this.
Okay, cool. So the IDI work I'm about to talk about that Michelle and I did was it included an analysis of claim rates over time for ACC's identified populations, plus some multiple regression modelling to find out what factors are most strongly associated with the likelihood of making a claim. Now, all of this analysis that I'm about to talk about does have the drawback that we can't identify where people got injured and didn't make a claim. And so where claim rates are lower for a group, you can't tell if that's because the group was on average less likely to get injured, or if it's because they were less likely to claim when injured. But what you will see is that you can use this analysis to kind of identify some smoking guns for further analysis. So areas where the data indicates that there might be a problem with access, and that can be followed up with further investigation. So there was quite a lot of detail in this analysis, which is way too much to go into now, but we'll just pull out a few key findings in the next couple of slides. So if we can move to the next slide. Okay, so to find out what factors are most strongly associated with claim rates when other things are statistically controlled for, we ran a number of multiple regression models in the IDI. So these used ACC claims data linked to administrative data on and census data on things like income, household composition, immigration status, and more. And this slide shows collated results across all of the models that we ran on the adult population. So it's the total adult population is the all adults column. And then the models that we ran on the ACC identified populations, Māori adults, Pacific adults, Asian, disabled. So up arrows indicate that the factor on the left had a positive correlation with claim rates, and down arrows indicate that there was a negative correlation. And if there are two arrows, then the effect is larger. And again, I won't go into detail, but for example, one interesting finding is that in most of these models, people who were born overseas were less likely to claim. But their likelihood of having a claim increased the longer they had been in New Zealand, and this is controlling for age, so age is not a factor there. So this is a kind of an interesting finding, and it has informed some investigative work that ACC is now doing into equity of access for migrants. Okay, so on the next slide. This is the other part of this analysis where we looked at claim rates over time for different groups. So this is just straight descriptive analysis. It's not using multiple regression. And again, it doesn't tell us if changes in claim rates over time are due to changes in injury prevalence or changes in the likelihood of making a claim when injured. But it does show some patterns that may warrant some further investigation. And I think the thing that stood out to me the most when we got these results was that in the left middle panel, where you are looking at claim rates among Pacific children aged 0 to 14 years, what you see is that this group had a steeper drop in claim rates during the COVID years than any of the other groups in this chart. And it's hard to imagine that that would be due to Pacific children specifically becoming less likely to get injured than other children during that time, and more reasonable to suspect that they experienced particular barriers to accessing the ACC scheme during the COVID years, and presumably barriers to healthcare more generally during that period. And so it's probably a good thing that the most recent data point on that chart, which was an update by ACC after I'd finished, is actually showing quite a strong uptick in claims for Pacific children. And I will pass back to Mairead.
Thanks, Andrea. So what we can see from what Andrea's just taken us through is that it's really important to delve into the variables for these groups with the intersectional approach that we've built into the work. And then we're able to segment and compare in this way to see some really interesting things. And that led us to what we're doing in our second year of access reporting, which I'll just take you through now. So the intersectional analysis has helped us to be able to get more granular, basically, about who faces the challenges in accessing the scheme and what are factors that we need to look at further that prevent people from being able to lodge claims, which, as just a reminder, that lodging claims is a proxy for injuries until we get injury prevalence data. So what we're doing at the moment is a deep dive into the characteristics of the new population of disabled people in the IDI. So this is using Census 2023 data. And we've got our performance and analytics team conducting the work. It's close to being completed, and we can really see the value in the intersectional approach to both regression analysis and descriptive analysis that Andrea and Michelle created, because we've been able to see what impact age, gender, socioeconomic status, and location variables have on claim rates for disabled people compared to non-disabled people, like within the subgroups as well. So we're seeing variables that clearly impact claim rates for groups within the disabled population. And this work will be publicly released with the second year of access reporting papers after March next year. Also, as part of this work, we're conducting 3 literature reviews. So we have a Māori-centred work stream, and that's to acknowledge that Māori are identified in the legislation as a population of interest. And so we've got a stream focusing just on Māori. And one of the things we know from Andrea's work is that Māori women, older Māori and Māori children, there are disparities in access to the scheme there. So here we're aiming to deepen our understanding of how material hardship and living rurally impacts access to the scheme, and what access pathways that there are to cultural, responsive and mainstream services for Māori women, older Māori and Māori children. And sorry, this is just a literature review to clarify the methodology that we're using there. Another thing that we're doing is a literature review on factors enabling scheme access for Māori disabled people, Pacific disabled people and Asian disabled people. And that's basically what it says on the tin. And then finally, as Andrea mentioned before, based on the findings that she had about people who are born overseas, we're conducting a literature review on what influences access to the health system and the scheme for Asian Pacific and MILA migrant communities. And so the research questions that we're answering there are: how do Asian Pacific and MILA migrant communities interact with the health system and the scheme in order to access services? And also, what are some successful ways to improve access to the health system and ACC for Asian Pacific and MILA migrant communities? So that's the end of our presentation. We've got time for questions, as I understand. And this picture is Ocean Beach in South Wairarapa a couple of winters ago, a picture that I took, and I thought people could do with a calm beach picture in these interesting times to reflect on while we talk about this work further. Thank you so much. You wanted me to stop sharing, hey, Ruth?
Yeah, let's have a look at who we've got here. If you wanted to turn on your screen, and if you wanted to ask a question directly, we can allow for that. But first, let's just go through. There's a few people who've put some questions in the chat, and if you'd like to talk to your question, please do so. So we have one question here earlier on in your presentation. For your comparator groups, does non-Pacific include Māori and Asian?
Shall I answer that?
Yep.
Yeah, we use total response ethnicity. So the non-Pacific group is anyone who didn't list Pacific as one of their ethnicities in their general social survey response.
Right. Sure. Julie has asked about the response rate and breakdown from the New Zealand Health Survey, and any impacts on the reliability of your data going forward.
That's a great question. I can't immediately pull that out of my head, apologies. But I understand that the New Zealand Health Survey, sorry, what's that thing where you like ask more people from certain populations that are less likely to respond to surveys?
Booster samples.
Thank you,
yeah.
booster sampling. I understand that the New Zealand Health Survey is booster sampled for Māori, Pacific, Asian, I think, and disabled people. But yeah, I can come back to you with a more considered response to that question.
Thank you. Just chip in, Julie, if you wanted to clarify anything else.
Sorry,
Susan,
it was
yeah.
me.
Yeah.
No, I
Kia
didn't
ora.
really. Kia ora. Thank you for your answer. Yeah, no, that's good. I understand you might not have it, you know, at the top of your mind necessarily. And yeah, and I didn't know they were using booster samples, so that makes sense. And yeah, that's useful. Thank you very much.
It's all good, Julie.
Susan, would you like to talk to your questions? You've got a few there, so maybe just take the first one around participants. Did you want to talk to that? I can read it if not.
Yes, happy to talk to that. Just wondered how confident you really are about how your results actually reflect real people, because I noticed you were seem to be doing a lot of statistical estimating, which doesn't always reflect actual people. So I wondered if you could just talk about that, like what were the actual numbers of real individual participants who responded to your research?
So, Susan, are you referring to the GSS and Sophie
I'm just
analysis that Andrea did? Because that was the statistical analysis of survey data that Andrea did. Is that what you mean?
I'm thinking about the bar graph where you
Yes.
set out the numbers of people and just like how many of those were actual real individuals who, for example, were interviewed and said, yes, I identify as Pacific Island and I could have claimed it, but I didn't. Like in terms of that data and actually coming from real participants who've given consent to the research, I'm just wanting to know what the numbers of real actual people were.
Yeah, so the again, I don't have the numbers off the top of my head, but these were people who had responded to the general social survey and been through, you know, all of the consent processes with that. And I think when you were talking with Māori injured people, I think it was a few hundred, but then lower, getting down to, I think, maybe 300 or so for Asian or Pacific. I could have those numbers a bit wrong. So yeah, and then there are weights applied to make them proportionate to the population based on age, gender, and ethnicity. But yeah, we're talking about several hundred people there, and that is one of the limitations of this type of work, is that the actual number of respondents is quite low, and then this is when you start to lose robustness in your statistical analysis. And I do think that this is one of the reasons why the approach that ACC has taken to iteratively doing quantitative analysis and then qualitative investigations involving, you know, reviewing the literature and going out and interviewing real people about their real experience is really a huge strength of this work.
Have you ever considered, like, normally people who might be able to access or able to access ACC get a referral from some type of clinician, whether it's a GP or whatever, or a physio? Have you ever sourced the actual referrals or from those clinicians?
Shall I just, because we actually did look at that, whether that was an option in the metadata trawl up front, whether we could do things with GP's notes, which in the end is maybe possible, but very large exercise for a very inconsistent data set. And then we also did a little bit of looking into, could we source things from physios, but there are problems with that not being representative of the wider pool of people who are injured, and also with there being no central consistent system for collecting data from those clinics. I don't know, Mairead, if you want to add to that.
No, that's correct. It basically didn't meet our feasibility or practicality threshold.
So Susan's other question was around, did you look at people who are afraid of using government systems or worried about their information security?
That's an excellent question. You'll be pleased to know that that's a theme coming out of the literature reviews that we're conducting at the moment. Definitely a barrier to accessing the health system, and in turn the ACC scheme is mistrust in government systems and information sharing. Yeah.
Thank you. I had one other question in there just around
You did too.
if you examined parties who could have made a claim to ACC, but perhaps because of all the hoopla and, you know, bureaucracy around doing that, actually chose to have their health needs met through other systems or processes.
Yeah, that's a good point, right, Susan? Because like even though everyone's entitled to access ACC, you can't drag people into the system, right? Like some people are like, nah, it's too much bother. And yeah, we're hoping to be able to dig deeper into that population once we get a better understanding of who is getting injured and then not lodging claims, because then we'll hopefully be able to dig into the reasons for that a bit more.
Awesome. Thanks.
Thanks, Susan, and thanks for those responses, Mairead. And Andrea, we have a comment from Eamon around the impact of the type of visa on reporting. Do you want to comment on that?
But it's just reflecting on a lot of the work that I've been doing, particularly around temporary migrant worker exploitation, and the high likelihood of not making a ACC claim or even reporting it in the first instance. So I was just wondering to what sense you see that in the data, given that that population is probably likely to be highly missing from the data.
Andrew, I'll let you speak about the data and then I'll talk about the literature review.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really important point, and one of the things that is quite crucial for government to understand these things. We did not look at that in our analysis, but there is visa data in the IDI, and that would be a really interesting piece of work to look at claim rates by visa type, and particularly seeing if we can are there differences between groups who are more likely to be under situations of exploitation than others. So I don't have an answer, but I just want to heart your comment.
Yeah, because I've had looked at some of the IDI data, particularly around income, which is also an issue, because I don't think it's necessarily the data that's in the IDI is really what people are getting in real life. It's on paper. So there's a lot of issues in terms of whether the IDI is actually, the data that's in the IDIs are a reflection of what's actually happening in reality.
So potentially worth following up with a qualitative response as well, although also a difficult group to reach, I imagine. Yeah,
exactly.
Yeah, and that comes back to what Susan was talking about before, or alluding to before, in the sense that like there are limitations to the IDI data, the administrative data sets, as I'm sure everybody here knows. Like you could argue that they collect information on people who have to interact with government, and potentially a deficit kind of perspective, and also like all data is a representation of the world. It's not the real world. So I think acknowledging that within our analysis is important as well. And Eamon, you'll be pleased to know that in the migrant communities literature review, like we've framed it at the moment as like legal barriers. So this fear of reporting an injury due to fear of visa compromise or the like is definitely coming through as a theme, as a barrier.
I think it's not just a legal thing as well. It's the employer would stop someone from reporting as well.
Oh yeah, I hear what you're saying. Yeah. Might be good to talk more.
Kia ora. Yes, that sounds like some interesting things to dig into, and the relevance of IDI is probably a whole new presentation. So let us know if you know someone who could talk to that. So that's the end of the questions in the chat, but we could open the floor now if you wanted to just ask an additional question before we finish. We've got a few minutes left. Go, Susan.
Sorry to be back again. I just wondered, given ethnicity is DNA determined and culture is elective, I just wondered how in your investigation you have determined ethnicity of the participants.
So I guess the short answer for that is that it's depended on the methodology that we're using. So like ethnicity for IDI analysis is determined, correct me if I'm wrong, Andrea, from census information.
It's a combination of sources that are prioritised, and I honestly, I don't remember the exact detail, but it can be pulled from census, it can be pulled from other health records, it can be pulled from various places, and then that goes into the central tables in the IDI that give the ethnicities that person has self-identified as at some point in their interaction with the data sets that are in the IDI.
Yeah, it's interesting because I've just been running quite a major research project where people can identify ethnicity, and often people will literally list multiple ethnic. And I just thought a lot depends on whether the question supports and allows people to identify their personal DNA diversity or not. But that's interesting that StatsNZ is talking about cultural affiliation. So that's more about an individual saying, I'm this, rather than, the DNA determination of ethnicity. So they're actually looking at culture as opposed to ethnicity.
So Susan, we do, sorry to interrupt you there, we do have a note in the chat from Tipairu that ethnicity is a measure of cultural affiliation. And so we absolutely would expect people to choose to identify with multiple ethnicities.
And so that was occurring in your investigations, was it? So someone might have said, I'm Asian, Samoan, Māori, Italian, or whatever. And then what would you do with those participants?
So because we use total group response, so people who selected multiple ethnicities were then counted within each group. So for example, if you were Māori and Pacific, you would be counted twice as both Māori and Pacific.
Okay, great.
Any other additional comments or questions before we close the session? It's been very, very interesting. It's fascinating, and you have so much knowledge there, you guys. Really interesting to hear you talk.
Thank you for having us. It's been a pleasure.
Can I have a question? Yeah. So I was wondering about whether you have considered the reasons for injuries and that connection with ACC claim, because for some people who are injured because of crime like sexual violence or family violence, they may not want to apply for ACC claim because of their concern or because they have other support. So did you consider that connection?
So again, Andrea, feel free to jump in. But we looked at the New Zealand Crime and Victim Survey as a potential data source for like unreported injury. And we also thought about looking at types of injuries as well. But what we decided was that it was more practical to focus on claims and the difference between injuries, like the prevalence of injuries and then claim rates. And I can't remember exactly why we decided the New Zealand Crime Victim Survey wasn't appropriate. I think it was because the sample size was too small for what we wanted to do.
There were two issues. One was the sample size, and the other was that for this initial analysis, at least, we were really wanting to find a data set that could be representative of the population and of the wider pool of injuries. And injuries due to crime are only a subset, although an important subset, of injuries. So we decided to focus our efforts elsewhere, but that would be a route that would be possible to take, is to look at that data on injuries from crime. And I don't know, Mairead, if your new questions in the health survey, if that does any breakdown of kind of injury cause.
No, it doesn't. It's just that was what we could get in, and we were like, well, it's a start. Yeah. Does that answer your question, Min?
Thank you. Yeah, that's
No
helpful.
worries. Good to see you. Thank you.
Kia ora koutou. So we're just going to close off. I wondered if before we do, so Sarah's going to close off for us, but would you be able to post the link to the report in the chat? Because it may not be available. I just tried to open it through the presentation. I couldn't. So if it's here, then people can access it straight away, and we'll also include it in the email which we'll send through this recording to you. Thank you.
Done.
Yes, thank you so much, Mairead, Andrea, and to you, Ruth, for curating the chat. So look out for emails for upcoming Kai and Korero sessions. We've got 2 scheduled before, well, 2 in the pipeline before the end of the year. And also look out for an upcoming workshop with Jeff Matthias on realist evaluations. So that would be something to keep an eye out for. And finally, I'm going to close with a karakia. So kia tau tō rangamari e, te runa ina iwi o te ao. Let your peace reign on all the people of the world. Kia ora and have a wonderful rest of the day.